Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's TAILS seminar. So today we have Dr. Sebastian Lerch. Uh, so a brief introduction of our speaker today. Dr. Lerch got his diploma, I think it's equivalent to master degree in mathematics at Heidelberg University, and also got states examen in mathematics and chemistry still in Heidelberg University. And then he got his PhD in Institute of Stochastics at Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, and he's now a professor at Department of Mathematics and Computer Science at the University of Marburg. So Dr. Lerch has done a lot of work in ensemble probabilistic forecasts, particularly on extremes. He has developed post-processing methods for the probabilistic forecast, including those using machine learning. And these post-processing, including different variables like wind and precipitation. And he applies them different time scales like weather forecast, subseasonal forecast, and also seasonal forecast. So today his talk is machine learning methods for post-processing global probabilistic forecasts on subseasonal timescale. So please take it away.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. So you should hopefully see the slides and now also in full screen. If not, then please.
Yeah, I can see your screen.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah. So thanks again for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation. As you heard, so my training is in more mathematics, and I have been working a lot on applied statistics and machine learning. So I'm not at all an expert in meteorology. So I will likely not be able to answer any detailed question on meteorological processes, but I'll be happy to try. And today I'm going to talk a bit about our work on post-processing on subseasonal timescales. And this is largely based, as you will see in a second, on two different publications. And the main scientific results come from a joint paper with Nina Horath, who is one of the PhD students in my group. So let me start with a short introduction. And as many of you will be aware, forecasts of the weather on subseasonal to seasonal timescales, so meaning timescales of somewhere between 2 to 6 weeks ahead, are increasingly important for many different sectors. And those include health, agriculture, in particular also energy or water resource management. However, as you will likely also know, physics-based weather prediction models, so NWP or numerical weather prediction models, tend to lose any sort of forecast skill they possess at those timescales. And one graphical illustration of this is this figure, which you may have seen in one or another variation. So what's shown here is the forecast skill of a typical numerical weather prediction model on the y-axis against the forecast range. And in blue, first you have maybe the weather forecasting or short or medium range forecasts of somewhere up to 10 days or 2 weeks. And there you start with excellent skill at initial time, but then the skill decays to having zero skill eventually after something like 2 weeks. But still, you have very good skill in the earlier lead times on these short range forecasts. And then you have seasonal forecasts where the interest typically is something like predicting a monthly average temperature, for example, or a seasonal averages. And their predictability largely comes from things like sea surface temperature conditions, Anso state, and so on. So you start with sort of fair forecast skill, and it slightly decreases over lead time, but sort of still stays fair. Now, today we are going to focus a bit on what's shown here in orange, which is the subseasonal to seasonal forecasting scale. So here it's forecasts somewhere between 10 and 30 days into the future, where the target of interest is typically something like a weekly average. We'll come back to this later in this talk. And there you see that, well, predictability comes from initial conditions and things like sea ice, stratosphere, or other sources of predictability. But we already start at sort of poor predictive ability, which then quickly decreases to having no predictive ability at all. So any sort of forecasting skill that we have gets lost quickly over time. So on the one hand, these forecasts on this timescale are increasingly important in different sectors. However, forecast skill is generally poor, which necessarily means that research on improving the skill of S2S forecasts is very important. And today we will focus on one particular aspect of improving S2S forecasts, which is via post-processing. Of course, you can also try to improve S2S forecasts by improving the numerical models themselves. What we are going to do today is a bit different. So we just leave the models as they are, but we apply post-processing methods to correct systematic errors. Now, this post-processing has become a standard practice in research, but also in operations at international weather services in short to medium range weather forecasting. So there, every weather service is applying their own post-processing techniques, whereby post-processing, I mean methods that take the forecasts from the physical models as input and then produce a corrected forecast as their own output. And these may be just a deterministic point-valued forecast, but this may also be a corrected ensemble forecast or a full distribution forecast. And in the recent years, a particular focus of research interest has been the use of modern machine learning methods for this purpose of post-processing, because techniques such as neural networks have shown to overcome limitations of traditional statistical methods that have been used and to show quite some gains in predictive performance. And one review paper that a couple of colleagues wrote a few years ago, led by Stefan van Nietzem, is this one, which appeared in BAMS. By now, everything is moving very quickly, so it's a bit outdated since it's from like 4 years ago, but it's still a good starting point for further reading if you want to find out more about the landscape of modern machine learning methods and their success in post-processing. Now, as I said, there is a lot of work on short to medium range weather forecasting, but if you look back into literature, in particular into the past few years, then there is a remarkable lack of post-processing approaches, in particular also machine learning-based post-processing approaches on S2S timescales, even though one may potentially expect that similar improvements should be possible. And in this talk today, I will try to address this, this issue or this question in 2 parts. So the first part will be my attempt to give an overview of specific challenges that come with post-processing on S2S timescales, in particular with applying machine learning methods for post-processing on these timescales. So this is largely based on a book chapter on machine learning for subseasonal to seasonal prediction, which will appear as a chapter in the book on S2S prediction by Andrew Robertson and Frédéric Vittard, which is currently being revised to become the part of the second edition of the book, which will appear later this year or next year. And this is a joint work with Kirsten Meyer, Catherine de Burgh-Day, and Mary Beth Arcodia, all from the US. Now, this is not available yet, but I'm happy to share a draft version of the book chapter if anyone is interested. So please just feel free to reach out. So this will be more an overview of challenges, but also opportunities for machine learning methods for post-processing. And then in the second part of the talk, I would like to present a concrete example of such a machine learning-based post-processing model, where this will hopefully showcase, on the one hand, some of the opportunities, but also maybe some of the challenges for machine learning on S2S timescales. And then I'll come back to put this all together in some short conclusions. So let's start with an overview of post-processing on subseasonal to seasonal timescales using machine learning methods. Now, the motivation for post-processing is, of course, that, as you will be aware, physics-based models for weather forecasting tend to have systematic errors. And these errors include biases. For example, deterministic forecasts tend to have certain biases. But if you also think about, for example, ensemble forecasts, then these ensemble forecasts often tend to not correctly quantify forecast uncertainty. For example, the spread in the ensemble tends to be too low, so the ensemble forecast underestimates the true forecast uncertainty. And the idea for post-processing is now to use statistical or machine learning methods which take these NWP forecasts as their input and then produce a corrected forecast as their output. So thereby we use forecasts of different meteorological variables as an input, but we can also use exogenous information, for example, information about the day of the year or the season or the type of station location that we are making a forecast for, and so on. And as I said before, a recent focus has been the use of machine learning methods, in particular neural network-based approaches, because they have been demonstrated to possess certain advantages. In particular, they allow to incorporate arbitrary predictor information. For example, using forecasts of multiple meteorological variables at the same time. They can also learn nonlinear relationships and thereby model flexible relationships between the input predictors and the outputs, which are the corrected forecasts. And just practically, they seem to lead to substantial improvements in forecast performance, and they overcome limitations of standard statistical methods. So to illustrate this a bit, I will, for the moment, stay on the sort of short to medium range weather forecasting timescale and just illustrate maybe how these post-processing models tend to work there before we then move to the S2S timescales. And to do this, I've brought here two examples of forecasts from the ECMWF ensemble. So these are forecasts that were made 2 days in advance, so 48-hour ahead forecasts of 2-meter temperature at Frankfurt International Airport in Germany. And what you can see here is a time series for sometime in March 2016. And you can see 50 gray lines, which are the forecasts from the 50 ensemble members. And you see the red line, which corresponds to the eventually observed temperature at Frankfurt Airport. And you can see that there is clearly a problem in the forecasts because the forecasts tend to be too low by a few degrees Celsius, which clearly poses a problem if you imagine being an operator at Frankfurt Airport, where you will be certainly interested in something like the probability of freezing on the runways, which here would be severely overestimated if the ensemble forecast tends to be too low by a few degrees Celsius. Here is the second example. So it's the same data set. I just picked a different period of time here. And you can see that here the ensemble forecast doesn't really seem to have a consistent bias over this time, but you can see a different problem. Because if you look at the red line of the observation, then if your ensemble was calibrated or was reliable or was able to correctly quantify forecast uncertainty, we would expect that the red line of the observations would be indistinguishable from any one of the gray lines. So it should look like one of these ensemble members, but here it clearly doesn't because the red line of the observations typically lands outside of this uncertainty range provided by the ensemble forecast. So the spread of the ensemble clearly is too low and the ensemble is too certain about what's going to happen and fails to correctly quantify forecast uncertainty. Now, to correct these errors, we can use post-processing models, and I think this will be the only formulas in this talk. So I apologize for the bit of mathematics here, but the model is actually fairly simple. So we use standard model for post-processing that's called the ensemble model output statistics or EMOS model. Here, for example, for temperature, and as an input, we use ensemble forecasts of temperature. So that's this X T2M, or the blue lines here in this graphical illustration. And we model the conditional distribution of the observation given these ensemble forecasts via a normal distribution. So we assume that our temperature observation takes the form of a Gaussian distribution, which has two parameters, location parameter mu and a scale parameter sigma, and we link these parameters to the ensemble forecast. So we set the location parameter to be a linear function of the ensemble mean forecast, and we set the scale parameter to be a linear function of the ensemble standard deviation. And then by learning these coefficients, A, B, C, and D from training data, we can learn how to correct the ensemble forecast. So how to map these blue lines, the ensemble predictions, to this green distribution or a Gaussian distribution with a location and a scale parameter. And this is done by optimizing some sort of suitable loss function for evaluating probabilistic forecasts, some proper scoring rules such as the continuous length probability score over a training data set. And what I want to show you is going back to the examples, the results of this. So what you can see here is now I've added blue lines to the plot, and these blue lines are post-processed forecasts. So I've estimated an EMOS model, or more specifically, this is like a neural network-based variant of these EMOS models, but qualitatively similar results. So the blue lines are quantiles drawn from the forecast distributions that we get as an output of this EMOS model. So this can be thought of as a post-processed ensemble. And you can see that here in this first example, this post-processing step is nicely able to remove the bias that you saw before. And in the second step, you can see that the post-processing model doesn't fundamentally change the central location of these forecasts, but now the spread is clearly increased, and now the red line of the observations tends to land within this uncertainty band provided by the post-processed ensemble forecasts. So the post-processed forecasts does a better job at quantifying forecast uncertainty. Now, this was sort of a standard statistical model, and as I said, lots of research activity has been focused on developing modern machine learning methods for this post-processing problem. Here is one example from a joint paper with Benedikt Schulz, who also was a PhD student in my group. And here we looked at different ways to characterize the forecast distribution using different types of outputs of a neural network for post-processing. So this was for wind gust over Germany. And we use sort of fairly simple, standard, fully connected neural network architectures, whereas inputs, we use forecasts from the NWP model at station locations over Germany, which you will see in a second. And as outputs, we use different ways to describe a probability distribution. So this could be a parametric distribution, as you saw before, where the neural network outputs distribution parameters. This could also be a quantile function, where here we use some sort of semi-parametric approximation of a quantile function. Or this could also be simply the density represented as a histogram, where we output probabilities of the observation falling into one of these bins. And we show in this paper that using one of these neural network models typically leads to the best performance when you compare a whole collection of different post-processing methods. So you can see here a map of Germany with all the locations of the 175 wind gust observation stations that we used data for. And at every station, we've color-coded the station by the best type of model at that station. And you can see the points are almost all green, and green corresponds to one of these neural network models here. So at almost all of these stations, a neural network model performs best. And these classical statistical models would have all been printed in yellow color, but you don't see any of those. So these statistical models fail to actually perform best at any of these stations when you compare them to either neural network models or sort of more classical machine learning models, which are in pink, like random forests, which perform best at a few selected stations, at least. So now let's, however, move from this weather forecasting scale to S2S post-processing, which will be the focus of this talk. Because on S2S timescales, there are several aspects which, at least I think, necessitate the development of specifically targeted methodology, and means that we cannot just take the approaches that were developed on short to medium range timescales and apply them out of the box. And those aspects include the target variable, the choices regarding the data, but also the availability of data, and also the representation of the forecast distributions. And I will briefly go through these different points and show some examples of what I mean by them. And I would like to start by this last point when we think about how forecast distributions are represented. Because if I go back one slide, on the medium range timescale, our forecast distribution typically is some sort of representation of the full probability distribution of the outcome. This could also be something like a calibrated ensemble forecasts. But in S2S settings, one common choice for representing a forecast distributions are tercile probabilities. So here you can see an example from a data set that we will be looking at later. So here the target is to make gridded forecasts of tercile probabilities. So you can see the plots have 3 different columns which correspond to below normal, near normal, and above normal temperatures. And the first column are the observations, and then here you can see forecasts from 2 models. The first one is the ECMWF ensemble, and the second one is a machine learning model that I'll present in the second part of the talk. And at every grid point, the models issue a probability forecast for the temperature being below normal, near normal, or above normal. So at every grid point, we get 3 probabilities for each one of those terciles, which add up together to 1. And you see that if you compare the ECMWF ensemble model and our machine learning model, that the colors are much more intense for the ECMWF model. So the ECMWF model tends to issue probability forecasts that are much closer to either 1 or 0. So the model is much more certain about what's going to happen and predicts much higher probabilities. Whereas the machine learning model here in the bottom is much more cautious. The probabilities are much closer to the climatological probability of just of 1/3. And we very rarely reach these very high or very low probabilities. Now, this is a very commonly chosen setting. So lots of, say, benchmarking or forecasting competitions or research papers, of course, also use these tercile probabilities. However, there is a challenge in doing this because it turns out that predicting the middle category is often very challenging because it can happen that the lower and upper edges which confine this middle category can be very close together. So this is shown here for different weeks of the year and temperature observations. And you can see here in color-coded is the distance between the edges confining the middle tercile category. And you can see that for very many grid points over the globe, this distance is actually very small. So something like 1 Kelvin only, which makes it very challenging on the one hand for models to predict this very narrow tercile, but on the other hand, also is potentially not that informative for applications. And if we go back, this also explains why if you look, for example, at the machine learning model, what it does for the middle category is like almost always just predict the climatological probability of 1/3. So this means that these forecasts for the middle category, as you will see later, are then more skillful than what the ECMWF ensemble does, but they're also not really informative because they pretty much correspond to the climatological probability, which means that potentially one may need to rethink whether tercile probabilities are really the desired output that is best suited for making forecasts on S2S timescales, or one maybe wants to move to full ensemble members or other ways to represent the forecast distributions. So this is one aspect that requires certain care on S2S timescales. Another aspect is thinking about the target variables, because in short to medium range forecasting, the target variable usually just is the direct observation at a specific location and time. For example, thinking back to this temperature example, we are predicting the temperature at a certain location, and then we can compare this to the actually observed temperature at that specific location. Now in S2S settings, forecasts are usually aggregated, so we're not interested in a specific temperature at a specific location and a specific point of time, but often aggregation is performed over time, looking at, for example, daily or a weekly or a biweekly averages, but also over space. So often one looks at averages over certain geographic regions or certain bands of latitude or longitude. Now, this means that one has to take some choices on what the actual target is, which is different across different projects and research papers, and means that it seems to be that there is no clear consensus on how one should aggregate. So should the target be daily averages? Should the target be weekly averages? And this means that results for different approaches and methods across different research papers may not be directly comparable, and you have different benchmarks and forecasting competitions which may all follow different approaches, and it may be unclear how the results will compare across these different benchmarks, for example. Another aspect related to these target variables is that when you think again about short to medium range post-processing, typically the target is the direct prediction of the NWP output. So typically we are just interested in the temperature forecast and we want to evaluate this against temperature. And this is also often the case on S2S timescales. For example, many forecasting competitions or benchmarking exercises also use directly the NWP output as a target, for example, in predicting global temperatures, as you saw in these tercile plots earlier and as you will see later in this talk. However, something that is maybe more rarely used in short to medium range timescales, but much more pronounced on S2S timescales are derived variables. What I mean by this are variables that are not directly the output of an NWP model, but are somehow derived from those using, for example, secondary models or some sort of other transformation. And examples are things like crop yields or the sea ice concentration or hydropower generation or large-scale circulation patterns such as weather regimes, or also teleconnection indices such as the MJO. So this means that from the perspective of post-processing, there is the question of how one should proceed. So should we start to post-process those by first taking the forecasts from the raw NWP output, post-process them to improve the NWP output, and then transform those towards the derived variables? Or should we take the raw NWP output and from those compute the derived variables and then develop a post-processing model for the derived variables? So this gives one two paths towards post-processing for derived variables, and it's not immediately clear which one is the better approach or which one should work better. On this, I would like to show you two examples from some projects that I was at least a part of. And the first one is looking at predictions of the MJO using the sort of two-dimensional RMM1, RMM2 definition of the MJO index. So this is a paper led by Riccardo Zellini with colleagues from the University of Barcelona, where we looked at an deterministic post-processing or bias correction, if you will, of the MJO index predictions. And what you can see here in this plot are different measures of the error. So the top row on the left is the amplitude error, on the right-hand side is the phase error, and you can see in black is the error of the raw ECMWF forecast without post-processing. The blue markers indicate the ECMWF forecast post-processed by some linear regression method. And then the orange one is a neural network-based post-processing. And you can see that with this neural network-based post-processing, the errors tend to be smaller, both for the amplitude and the phase, and also if you compute the RMSE. So we do get some improvements in the errors and some higher correlations, but yeah, the improvements are not huge. And also the improvements over this linear regression method are visible, but also not huge. But we do get some improvements, and we do get a bit better forecasts of the MJO index. So here we sort of follow the second route, or we take the raw NWP inputs, compute the MJO predictions from those, and then apply the post-processing to the derived raw forecasts. Now, a second project that I wanted to show here is work with colleagues at KIT in Karlsruhe in Germany by Fabian Mockert, who was also a PhD student in my group. And here in his work, we looked at post-processing of weather regime forecasts. So there's a certain 7-dimensional weather regime definition based on the Euro-North Atlantic region. You can see the different abbreviations for these weather regimes here, and they have been demonstrated to have some sort of informative value when it comes to, for example, wind power generation then over Europe. And what we did in this paper is we developed probabilistic post-processing methods for these weather regime forecasts and compared the resulting forecasts to the raw ECMWF predictions. And what you can see here is the result of this comparison. So what's shown is a little bit complicated. You can see different colored lines. Every color corresponds to one of these weather regimes. And what we show is how many lead time days you gain by post-processing in the following sense. So say you pick a certain threshold in terms of the CRPS. CRPS is continuous ranked probability score, which is one metric for evaluating probabilistic forecasts. Say 5%, which means that we consider a forecast to be skillful if it's 5% better than climatology when evaluated with the CRPS. And then we compute the skill horizon for the raw forecasts. So maybe we get something like 10 days. So at 10 days, the raw forecast has 10 days is the last day where the raw forecast has a 5% improvement in terms of the CRPS over the climatological forecast. And then we do the same for the post-processed forecast, and when we plot the difference here. So you can interpret this plot here as the difference of how far into the future can we pass this scale horizon threshold. And this is shown against this threshold. So this is all positive, which means that post-processing always leads to a lead time gain. So we always improve the forecast of the raw ensemble, but how much we improve depends on the skill threshold that you use and on the weather regime. For example, in this 5% case, for some regimes, we get a lead time gain of something like 1 day. On others, we get something like a 3.5-day lead time increase. On average, for this threshold would be something like 2 days. So we do get some lead time gain, but this is also not huge. So maybe we gain like 2 days of lead time on something like a 3-week forecast, and one can maybe question how meaningful this will be in practice. We'll come back to this point later. Now, after these preliminary considerations, I'd now like to move to this second part, and I will show some specific models based on neural networks that we developed for post-processing S2S forecasts. And to do this, I would like to first introduce the WMO S2S AI challenge. This happened now 4 years ago, in 2021. This was a prize challenge to improve S2S forecasts using AI, which was organized by the World Meteorological Organization in collaboration with the World Weather Research Program and this S2S prediction project. So this was actually a big challenge. The aim of this challenge was to foster the use of AI for specifically post-processing, with the aim to improve S2S forecasts and also to promote this S2S database that resulted from this S2S project. There was actually quite a sizable prize pool for this, so 30,000 Swiss francs, roughly $30,000 US. And the organizers provided NWP forecasts, so forecasts from the ECMWF model, along with observation data to all the participants. And then the participants were tasked with developing prediction models using whatever techniques they wanted. And these data sets, as well as the final forecasts of the participating teams, have now become available online. And as you will see, we will be using them as database for model development here. So initially, there was a lot of interest in this challenge. I think something like between 50 and 100 teams registered. However, the results were sort of mixed, I would argue, for this challenge. So out of those many teams, only 9 teams made a submission. And out of those 9 submissions, only 5 submissions actually beat a climatological forecast. So meaning if you would have just predicted tercile probabilities of 1/3 for every grid point and time, you would already have scored within the top 5 submissions of this challenge. So even though there was quite a sizable prize pool, only 9 teams decided to submit anything, and out of those, only like half of the teams made something that actually was able to beat a trivial baseline model. So yeah, to some extent, there were some models that actually did work and did produce some good forecasts. And I think in the end, this is a valuable data set that can be used, and I'll show how we use that data set later on. But on the other hand, I assume that maybe the challenge organizers were hoping for a bit more participation and a bit more successful entries. So you can read more about the challenge in this 2022 BAMS paper by Frédéric Vittard and colleagues. So we will use that data to now develop a CNN-based model. So a bit more detail on what the data set actually includes. So these are global forecasts and reforecasts from the ECMWF model with the aim to predict precipitation and temperature. So this consists of 2 parts, and one part were the reforecasts. This is an 11-member ensemble, and we had 20 years of data available, so 2000 to 2019. And then for the year 2020, which was used as the test data set, one had the actual forecasts, which had 51 members. So here it means one has to go from 11 to 51 members, which may pose a challenge for some post-processing approaches. And the forecasts were global, which had a spatial resolution of 1.5 degrees and a temporal resolution of 2 weeks, meaning that the target was to predict biweekly aggregated values of average daily temperature and accumulated precipitation over lead time weeks 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. And then the verifying observations were taken over land from the NOAA Climate Prediction Center. And the prediction task, as you have seen now already, was to make probabilistic forecasts for tercile categories below normal, near normal, and above normal values of the target variables. And these categories were determined based on the empirical quantiles of the observations from the training period. So they were computed separately for every grid cell and for every week of the year to ensure that this climatology is informed by location and also by season. And by construction, a natural baseline then is a climatological prediction, which would be to just assign a probability of 1/3 to each category. And the way in which these forecasts were compared is then by computing the ranked probability skill score, which means that you get a score of 0 if you just issue the climatological predictions. What you also got as a baseline was the ECMWF ensemble. So that's the operational forecast from the ECMWF ensemble for the test year. And there you can just compute probability forecasts by counting how many members fall into the corresponding bins. And when we then use the data, we, however, discovered a problem, because if you just sum the tercile probabilities of the ECMWF ensemble predictions, they do not sum to 1. And this caused a great confusion to us. You can see a plot here. This is, I think, for precipitation for these week 3 and 4 and week 5 and 6 forecasts. And if a grid point has a color, then the cumulative probability is above 1. And you can see that for a lot of grid points, that actually is a problem, and that the tercile probabilities don't sum to 1. So we then went back to the challenge organizers and we asked for the original code to produce these forecasts, and then discovered there was a small bug in the code that was tied to an erroneous treatment of missing values in the ensemble members. And this means that we were able to implement a corrected baseline for precipitation. And you will see the implications of this correction later on. So now, this means that given the data that is available, what we can use as inputs to our post-processing models are these global ECMWF forecasts or reforecasts. And what we do is we do not take forecasts of all ensemble members, but we just use the deterministic forecast provided by the ensemble mean. So we compute the mean for, on the one hand, the 2 target variables, and as additional variables, we use the ensemble mean for the geopotential height forecasts at 500 and 850 hectopascal level. And for temperature, we also included the sea level pressure field and the total column water field for precipitation. So we do some sort of pre-processing that I try to briefly describe here. You can find, of course, more details then in the paper if you're interested in this. For the target variables, we do some sort of normalization by computing the distance of the ensemble mean to the tercile category edges. And for the other variables, we compute some anomaly values compared to a local and week-specific climatology. And we train the model based on these 20 years of reforecasts. And we then evaluate the models, of course, on the test data set. And we do have 20 years of reforecasts, but they are only initialized every week, which means that in the end, we only have roughly around 1,000 training samples of global forecast fields. And when you think about like typical scales of data sets of machine learning models, then this is actually not that much data. So we will both consider a global, but also patch-wise training model. I come back to this in a second. So here is one model that we propose for global post-processing. So this is called a UNet model, where UNets are a specific CNN-based neural network architecture. They are called UNets because they have this sort of U shape in which they are displayed. And as inputs, you can see we use these global ECMWF ensemble mean forecast fields, and they are transformed via different CNN layers. So all these layers are certain CNN layers with different filter sizes. And what's happening in these UNet models is that you sort of reduce the dimension via an operation that's called average pooling. So your images, if you will, get smaller and smaller, and you have more and more filters, and then you increase these dimensions again. And you have these, it's called skip connections. These are these dashed arrow lines, which means that when doing this upscaling step again by increasing the image resolution, you concatenate or you append the representation that you had in the corresponding earlier level here and add this information. And this is a type of model that has been developed for image segmentation problems and has shown great success in traditional image processing or image-to-image prediction tasks. And here we also want to solve some sort of image-to-image prediction task, because as an output, what we want in the end are global maps of tercile probability forecasts. So what we want to get out in the end is a three-dimensional map where at every grid point we get a probability value for above normal, near normal, and below normal values, or the probability of the value being above, near, or below normal. So our UNet model maps these global ensemble mean forecast fields to global probabilistic tercile forecast fields. Now, this was the global model. So the input is the global forecast, the output is the global forecast. What we also considered when developing models was a patch-wise training strategy. So the idea here was that we do not take the global map as an input, but we split this global map into smaller domains or patches. And you can see this here. So we take the red box indicates what we take as an input patch, and the green box inside is what's the output where we try to make a prediction. And then we take this box and we shift this box over the globe and then stitch this back together. And when training the model, we just randomly draw one of these patches and show this patch to the model, and thereby estimate the model over showing it multiple patches. And one advantage of this is that doing it this way, you can see this as a sort of data augmentation strategy, because instead of just having 1,000 global fields available as training data, we now increase this number to around 30,000 training samples that consists of these different patches. However, of course, the disadvantage of this is that we lose all sort of global context information that we have, because the model is ever only able to look at one of these small patches at a time and cannot learn information that come from a different part of the globe that may be still informative for this single patch here at the moment. So we also applied this patch-wise training to the UNet model and to two alternative approaches, which I would like to very briefly discuss on this slide here. So again, we proceed as before. We have our global forecast fields of ensemble means. We cut out a small patch. You can see the patch here. This was the red area that you saw on the plot before. And then we put this through a convolutional neural network, so a CNN model, to learn some sort of low-dimensional representation. And then what we have to do is we have to turn this representation again into an output of tercile probabilities on the target patch, which is the small area inside this original input patch. And we consider two ways for doing this. The first one is what we call here the basis function CNN. This was based on an earlier paper by colleagues from the US who had used sort of a more spatial statistics motivated idea of defining certain basis functions. Then you learn coefficients which form these forecasts as a weighted sum of these different basis functions. And we also considered a much simpler approach where we just sort of upscale these values back to grids of the desired size, and we just enforce them to be probabilities here. So these are two alternative CNN-based models that we considered for patch-wise training. But as you will see, they are not as successful as the UNet models that you saw before. So just very briefly on model training, we optimize categorical cross-entropy, which is a standard machine learning loss for these sort of probabilistic classification problems. We also considered doing something like a weighted loss, where the weights account for the area of the grid cells, which is something which is widely used in this subseasonal to seasonal post-processing, and we do cross-validation to optimize the hyperparameters. And all of this is implemented in Python using the Keras TensorFlow framework, and all code is available online if you're interested in the code. Now, when looking at the results, I would like to start by showing you here some example forecasts. So these are, again, here in the those that you saw before. So the top shows the observation, then the ECMWF forecasts, and we saw already the UNet global forecasts. And you can see that, as I told you before, the machine learning model is much more cautious when doing these probability predictions. So they are much closer to the climatological predictions, especially for the middle tercile, where they are much closer to these 1/3 probability. Whereas the machine learning model, the ECMWF model, sorry, is predicting higher probability, so much sharper forecasts. So these are the patchwise models that you didn't see before. And here you can see one problem of these patchwise models, specifically if you look at the second and third rows here, because there you can see very clear remnants of these patches in these forecasts, which is not visually very appealing. It maybe doesn't matter much for computing scores, but when you look at these forecasts, they will not look like realistic forecasts. So this is, of course, an effect of like doing this patchwise training and doing more careful patch selecting and stitching together. One may be able to alleviate this, but like for these models, you can clearly observe these artifacts still for these two models, at least. For the UNet model, there's a little bit of that if you take a very close look and zoom in, but it's not as bad as for the other two CNN. So for the evaluation, as I told you, this is all based on computing the ranked probability score for the test year. And this is done grid cell wise for all the Thursday forecasts in the test year, and then aggregated as a weighted average. So this can be interpreted as an improvement over climatology, larger values indicating better forecasts. And there are certain ways to not take the Antarctica into account and very dry regions as well for precipitation. And this is sort of the one slide overview of the results. So what you can see is the RPSS, so the skill score. So larger values indicate better forecasts. 0 values mean that you are doing as well as climatology. And you can see on the left-hand temperature, right-hand precipitation, weeks 3 and 4, and 5 and 6. And the ECMWF model is in blue, and the orange ECMWF model is our corrected version of the ECMWF model. And you can see that the ECMWF model has some skill for temperature, which however is pretty much 0 at weeks 5 to 6. And for precipitation, the skill is actually negative. So the ECMWF model is doing worse than just climatology on the precipitation variable. And all the other bars correspond to our machine learning model. So the green and red line are the UNet model. Green is global, red is patchwise. And the brown and purple lines are the CNN models. And you can see that UNet models perform better. They yield the best forecasts for temperature, and for precipitation, all forecasts actually yield positive skill, although smaller skill than for temperature. And again, the UNet model do better. Global models here do a little bit better, where for temperature, the patchwise models do a little bit better. But overall, UNet models do better here. Can also go back and compare this to the physics-based model. Here you can see the RPSS, which we computed for the UNet model for precipitation. But using the ECMWF model as a baseline, so reddish colors indicate grid points where our model is better than the ECMWF model, blue points where it's worse. And the majority of points is red, but there are also locations where the ECMWF model is actually doing better. So it's not like clear-cut result that we are be doing better but at all locations on the globe. So let me maybe skip this. So this is an illustration of the reliability, where you have to use these sort of three-dimensional reliability diagrams, but for reasons of time, I'll skip this. You can find details in the paper if you are interested. And instead, I would like to come to some brief conclusions and outlook. So to summarize, what I've shown you is that in this second part, we showed CNN-based post-processing models, which do show, I would argue, solid performance. The global UNet model does best overall. And an advantage also that has lower computational costs than these patchwise approaches. Now, if we would have gone and participated in the challenge with these models, they would have placed second or third, depending on the variable and lead time. Of course, that's sort of not fair because we didn't participate with these models in the challenge, but we would have placed second or third if we would have. And one key distinguishing feature, if you look at our models compared to the models that actually scored better in the challenge, is that we do not rely on single grid cells only, but we try to build global models that utilize spatial context information via these convolutional neural networks. And this might have some advantages for precipitation in particular. For example, if we compare our model to the other models, then we see that we do have the best performance in the tropics, where maybe learning from the spatial context is more relevant. But it also means that we have potentially worse performance in regions that have very specific errors or biases for a lower number of grid cells, things like the southern extratropics, where we are doing worse than the other models. So this comes with like benefits, but also with drawbacks potentially. Now, some open questions, I think, is that on the one hand, we asked ourselves if we can somehow try to further improve these models, in particular by incorporating additional predictive information. So for example, it seems to be clear that there are certain meteorological variables that do carry some predictability on S2S timescales, things like the soil moisture or sea surface temperature. And one would hope that if you include this information, or if you include information that carry some sort of slowly varying components of the climate system, like the MJO index or the state of the stratosphere, then incorporating those into the models should enable more skillful forecasts also on longer timescales via Taylor connections. So we went ahead and we tried this, but we failed. And we talked to many other people who also tried this and who also failed. And this seems to be very hard to actually achieve. And even if you build very specific machine learning architectures tailored to trying to utilize these information, it seems to be very hard to really find some reliable improvements. So I think an important open question is like, of course, maybe what can this achieve by doing something more clever than we did, but also can we maybe better understand what actually causes model errors in NWP models and how we can maybe better use those information sources in post-processing. So can we better understand where model errors come from, how they propagate over lead times? And it seems like all these theoretical statements seem to be true. And if you know what to look at, you will find exactly these patterns in the forecast errors, for example, but then the signal to noise ratio may be too low to reliably implement this in a post-processing context. And another question, I think, is that we just have looked at forecasts of the direct meteorological variables. I argued in the beginning that S2S forecasts are important for different sectors, but then I think one should also include this in the evaluation. For example, just look at downstream implications of post-processed versus not post-processed weather forecasts to, for example, evaluate how much economic benefit they can generate in, for example, forecasting renewable energy generation. So I was telling you about this S2S AI challenge. There is at the moment a new version of this challenge running. It's called the AI Weather Quest, organized by ECMWF. It has started, I think, something like 5 or 6 weeks ago. And this is again a challenge to improve S2S prediction using AI machine learning, now focusing more not on post-processing, but on sort of direct forecasting with AI-based weather models. And there are first results, I think, already available with some teams participating. Now to draw some final conclusions, I have hopefully demonstrated that post-processing can notably improve forecast skill, also on S2S timescales, and modern machine learning methods may be helpful to improve further and to also leverage spatial context information. However, like, as a final point I would like to make is that despite these clear improvements, the overall skill also of the post-processed forecast still remains sort of limited in all these applications that you saw. So we still get to an RPSS of maybe something like 5% improvement over climatology. And I think it's not clear how much that improvement really matters in practice. So if it's just statistical significance or some sort of real world significance. And some overarching challenges when it comes to developing these machine learning models for S2S post-processing is in particular also the available size of the data sets that you have, because you saw even if you have 20 years of reforecast, this corresponds to just 1,000 forecast observation pairs, which is nothing if you compare this to the millions or billions of training data points that modern machine learning methods use. And as a final comment, you will all have seen all these data-driven AI-based weather models. They tend to work, or they seem to work very well on medium range forecasting tasks. And it will be interesting to see how this translate over to S2S forecasting and what new challenges may come with this for post-processing, because they may have other types of errors that may need to be corrected. So with this, yeah, thank you very much for your attention, and I apologize for running a bit over time, but I'm happy to answer questions if there are.
Great, thank you. So, any questions? Go ahead, Minghua.
Yes, thank you for this very interesting talk. This is certainly very useful. My question is regarding the data you mentioned. For the global post-processing, you had 1,000 basically samples, 20 years weekly. And then you used the patch-wise. So if I understand correctly, you are doing just one model for all the patches, therefore the data sample is increased. But then the underlying assumption of a single correction model for all regions could be questionable, and I wonder whether you have thought of using a few models for different regions, like land versus continent, or based on different latitude, so you make a compromise between the number of data samples versus the number of models.
Yes, so this is an excellent point. I was a bit short, I think, on explaining this, because you are correct in that we use like a single model for all the patches. But what we do is we also tell the model where this patch is located on the Earth. So as an additional input to these models, we use some information about where the patch is, something like the coordinate of the lower left edge of this patch. This at least should allow the model to learn this, but you are correct. So there may be better strategies to achieve this. For example, using this for different like latitude levels, or using this for different geographical regions. One challenge in implementing this is that you have to be sort of careful about the patch selection, because the observations are only over land grid points. So this means that if you have a patch that's completely in the ocean, then you don't have any observations there and you can't really train this. So you have to somehow find a clever way to distribute the patches over the land grid points, that you have sufficiently many observations within a patch to be able to train this model. And you then can, of course, vary the size of the input patch, the size of the output patch, the sort of stitching overlap of these patches. So we did lots of experiments with this, but you could very likely do better if you would have more resources, or could do more hyperparameter tuning in the end.
Yeah,
but yeah, all don't know where the patch is, essentially.
Yeah, a quick follow-up. Suppose the modeling centers make changes to their forecasting model, then you will be at the mercy of whether they do enough reforecasting for the past. Is that right? The model will need to be retrained.
Yes, that is a very good point. So here we use this data where we had the reforecast available. If you move to a new model version, then you would hope that there would be reforecast as well. And this is a big problem also in operational post-processing. So we are working in many projects with colleagues from weather services, and there you have a continuous upgrades of your model, and many weather services do not have the resources to run long reforecasts for every model cycle update. So what they do often is they just ignore the model updates. And depending on how much the model update maybe influences the specific inputs and outputs you're looking at, the effects on post-processing may also be just large or not so large. So this is an important problem. You would hope that there would always be enough reforecast available. And there have been lots of discussions on how meteorological centers should distribute their resources. So should maybe they devote more resources into making longer reforecasts to then achieve better forecast quality in the end, because you allow for better post-processing. Yeah, this is an important consideration.
Thank you.
Kamazima?
Thank you. Thank you, Sebastian, for a nice talk. I really enjoyed this. So I see that you're concentrating using the convolutional neural network. Have you tried to maybe change, and this in terms of improving the attention, including attention in your models, like LSTMs or using transformers?
Yeah, so this is also an excellent question. We did try. Especially, so I said in the end when we wanted to look at how can we include other information into these models. We tried a lot of different approaches. We tried vision transformer type models. We tried models that were specifically designed to add other information in sort of batch normalization layers, so-called film layers in these models. But the problem was that even if you go to more complex models, nothing really seemed to improve the forecast and nothing really seemed to work. And I think one reason why this might be the case is that there is just not so much training data available. So if you would have maybe much longer reforecasts, then you might be able to also learn much more complex structures and relationships in the data. But if you just have 1,000 global fields, then maybe these models that we use were somehow at the maximum complexity where you can somehow reasonably exploit the data. And if you would have much longer forecasts, much more training data, you might be able to do something. You might also be able to exploit this if you would consider like different lead times. We also experimented with like training models based on multiple lead times, but it always seemed to be a core problem that the signal to noise ratios seem to be so low that it seems to be hard to learn relevant additional information beyond what you can sort of learn with these models, even if you use like transformers or other types of models.
Okay, there's also an online question by Aaron, so I will read the question. When comparing the skill scores between the global and patchwise UNet model, their skill scores vary between temperature and precipitation prediction. UNet patchwise performs better in temperature prediction, yet UNet global performs better in precipitation prediction. Do you have any ideas why? Was there any seasonality in the predictive skill for either temperature or precipitation between the global and patchwise versions?
Yeah, so this is a good point. We did look at different aspects of how the skill differs and also where it differs. I think in the paper there is also an analysis by geographic region, for example. So I think the comparison is a little bit challenging because also the grid points are not exactly the same, because for precipitation, grid points that are too dry to some extent are excluded. So you are comparing sort of different geographical regions. We also looked a little bit at seasonal effects, but there you only have 1 year. So I do not have like a concluding answer. Some initial guess might be that the global model has the advantage of having this global context information, which potentially might be better for precipitation because you maybe can get higher improvements in certain regions like the tropics, which will then translate here to higher overall improvements than these patchwise models, which just have the local information. But for temperature, there's maybe not so much global context information that you can use there compared to precipitation, which means that the patchwise model might be doing better because it's better able to learn specific location biases. But yeah, it's difficult to answer conclusively, I think. Also, there's potentially a fairly high uncertainty in these scores because these are just 53 model runs from the year. So of course, there also, if one would have a longer training data set, this of course would be a better or longer test data set for a more conclusive and robust evaluation. But there are more results in the paper if you're interested specifically in geographical differences, for example.
Okay, so I have one final question, a quick question. So I think for all these competitions and all the results you've shown here, the testing or the evaluation data is just from 1 year, which is like 52 forecasts if it's weekly. do you think that's enough data for evaluation? How much uncertainty we'll see if just evaluating the performance within 1 year?
Yeah, so I think that's it's not enough data, and I think there will be a huge uncertainty. But on the other hand, you somehow have to sort of deal with what you have available, right? And
Yep.
as a statistician, so my hope would be that we would have much more training data and much more test data, and that we could just like draw more robust conclusions. And I mean, here there was for this S2S AI, this first S2S AI challenge, there were lots of challenges in the setup of this. For example, what happened is like they started the challenge and they provided also the test data from the beginning in this challenge. So all the teams had the test data already available when like, fitting their models. So you don't have any guarantee that somebody doesn't use the test data for model fitting, and that's why they had very complicated rules on not using the test data, and you had like to declare this when you were submitting forecasts. And that's something they are doing different now in the new challenge, this AI Weather Quest challenge, where this is actually run in real time over a year. So you make forecasts every week for then what happens in 3 or 4 weeks ahead. So this will also mean there's only like 1 year of data available in the end, but I think forecasts are made also just 1 week. So it will not be more test data, but at least it will be really out of sum. But if you would want to do this for this sort of competition framework with more test data, this would mean that people would have to participate much longer or make much more frequent forecasts. So it's also a challenge for the teams that are participating, I suppose, in producing these forecasts, especially when these are like PhD students participating. They can't do this for like 5 years as their main job, of course.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's all for today's seminar. So thanks everyone for joining, and let's thanks our speaker again.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for the invitation again.